Welcome back to TLDR's UK politics podcast, Starmergeddon. I, Georgina Finley, am your host for this week, and I'm once again joined by TLDR's UK politics aficionado, Ben Blissett.
I get a new title every week. I love it.
I know, I'm coming up with new nouns for you each time. So in Starmergeddon, we talk about a main conversation item every time this happens. We also do our cabinet review where we discuss one of Starmer's cabinet ministers, and we have some other stories at the end of the episode. So stay tuned for all of that. But before we get in today's main discussion, which is a big one, we have an even bigger announcement, Ben. So we're recording this on Wednesday. By the time it gets to you guys, it will be Friday. And tomorrow, Ben, you have, without doubt, the biggest moment of your career.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us what's happening / will have happened on Thursday?
So I don't know what people watching will have seen. Obviously, we put out a thing as we were recording last night, so it would have been Tuesday night, asking people for questions to the government on the UK's defence spending uplift. We didn't say why we needed those, but the reason we needed those is because tomorrow I'm interviewing the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, on his defence spending plan. So we're going to be putting questions to him from the TLDR audience about defence spending. We've handpicked a few of those, covering a range of different topics. So that interview will be going on the TLDR News UK channel very soon. So it's not out yet as this podcast releases, but it will be very soon. So make sure, if you're watching, make sure you're subscribed, make sure you're checking that channel in the next couple of days because it'll be out very soon.
Yeah, and that is the biggest interview that anyone from TLDR could be doing.
It is a big one.
It is a big one, and a step up from Rachel Reeves, who you interviewed at conference last year.
Yes, exactly.
How are you feeling about it right now? How do you feel about the questions we've got?
I'm feeling good. I've got to say, I would hope that this podcast attracts the core TLDR audience. So some people watching might have written questions. I just want to say a big thank you to everybody that did fill out that form. We posted it very late on Tuesday night, and it had to, just because of the timings with the government, had to close quite early today on Wednesday. So there was a short window for people to submit questions. Not only did people submit questions, they were really good. They were really, really strong. They were really detailed, really knowledgeable, and gave me, not that I ever doubted it, but gave me renewed faith in the TLDR audience. I think
renewed faith.
Renewed faith.
Yeah. So, seconded. Yes, I helped Ben go through all the questions, and they were really great. And
they were excellent.
Really wide variety, and really great to know that people are interested in
there
so
were
many
loads
areas.
as well from secondary school children. And I've got to say, when you're going through the list and you were looking at the questions, they were just as sort of deep and analytical and sort of to the point as all the other questions. You wouldn't have been able to tell. So if any of those secondary school children that submitted questions are watching, they were excellent.
Yeah, and great geographical variety as well. I enjoyed seeing where all the questions were coming from. We had a few from outside the UK, which was nice, but also mainly good to see them all coming from within the UK, because we know that people take interest in what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
In their own country. So keep your eyes open for that next week. And with that very exciting announcement out of the way, let's get into today's main topic. So today, our main topic, we are going to be discussing Starmer's Ukraine peace plan and his kind of attempts to bridge this US-EU divide, which is becoming very apparent now over Ukraine.
Yes.
So do you want to lead us into this conversation, maybe discuss, because the news has been moving so fast in the past few days and weeks. We've both been up very late, finishing scripts and catching up with the day's events. Do you want to explain what's been happening from a UK perspective over the past 2 weeks, let's say?
Yeah, so I think the sort of heightened news cycle, especially in the UK, really began last Thursday when Starmer visited the White House for the first time as Prime Minister. Obviously, we've discussed that before in a number of different videos, and I won't get into it too much here because that's not really what we're discussing here. But just as a very quick bit of background, he was going there to really sort of improve his personal relationship with Trump. We know, he knows, all of his staffers know that Trump operates very much on a sort of personal relationships level. We saw that on Friday with the fallout from Zelensky, what can go wrong when that personal relationship fails. So Starmer was very keen to try and set that. He brought this letter from the king to try and sort of the phrase I've used this week is butter him up. There's probably a better phrase, but, very bluntly, that is what he was doing, and trying to improve his sort of diplomatic relationship between the two.
And this followed Macron's visit 2 days prior. Exactly. Macron, of course, president of France, who also took a similar approach in trying to kind of smooth, almost like buff the relationship.
Yes.
Smooth it down a bit before Zelensky was traveling on Friday.
Yeah.
And so how did this meeting between Starmer and Trump go?
Well, by all accounts, it went remarkably. I think it was sort of the best that Starmer could have hoped for, par one thing, and that was and it's good that you mentioned Macron's visit, because they sort of both failed in this regard, which was, I say failed. I think it was a tall order, and I don't think anybody in the press has really, reported it as a failure because of how difficult the task was. But it was to try and get a US security guarantee for Ukraine. So we'll get into that a little bit more in a moment when we're discussing Starmer's Ukraine peace plan. But essentially, it's just getting the US to commit to backing up a European force, peacekeeping force in Ukraine when a peace deal is signed between Ukraine and Russia. So that is a tall order. It was a hard thing to achieve, and he didn't quite get that yet. Obviously, he would probably argue that he's laying the groundwork. This would be a long-running conversation, be a difficult one to establish. So, maybe it was, he might not have been able to get that just on Friday alone. But aside from that, everything went very smoothly. Trump seems very happy with Starmer, praised him, managed to avoid tariffs being implemented, being levied against the UK in the same way that Trump is levying them against, countries around the world, including obviously the EU. So the fact that he's avoided that, the fact that Trump seems to be very fond of the UK, very fond of Starmer, that's exactly what he was hoping for. In another presidency, that might not matter as much, but we know how Trump operates. We know that he operates on these personal relationships. We know that this matters.
It's interesting, though, that you say Starmer's meeting went remarkably well in all respects but one. In my view of it, I think that one respect is almost the whole point of why Starmer went last week, same as with Macron.
Yeah.
And I think, personally, after Starmer's meeting with Trump on Friday, I agree all the press that came out was overwhelmingly positive. People, including some right-wing tabloids, which I think surprised everyone, were very positive about that meeting. First thing on Friday morning, you had these really glowing reviews of the Starmer-Trump bromance, the tabloids were saying on Friday morning. And for a period of less than 24 hours, I guess, all of that press was really, really positive and things felt really good. And I think Starmer and Macron felt that they had done as well as they could have done effectively to make the case for a broad transatlantic, i.e. US and EU alliance on supporting Ukraine. But then we got to Friday, which has put maybe a slightly different spin, or it's kind of cast those events into a bit of a shadow. Do you want to explain how things have changed?
So effectively, I'm sure everybody watching has probably seen the clip already, but in the Oval Office, Zelensky had a meeting with Trump. Obviously, JD Vance was there, Marco Rubio, but the meeting just went terribly. I mean, it was a diplomatic car crash. I mean, one of the worst sort of public arguments I've really seen between two supposed allies. In all the time that I've been doing this job, it was really quite a brutal thing to watch. There was, again, it goes back to what I was saying before, the personal relationship between Trump and Zelensky seemed to break down. There's been a lot of analysis for why this happened. Essentially, JD Vance and Trump were accusing Zelensky of not being grateful, not being respectful. Zelensky sort of tried to push against that a little bit. He was shouted down. And then we've seen the fallout from that in the days since. We've seen the US suspending aid shipments to Ukraine. We've seen Trump go further in his sort of distancing from Ukraine and sort of getting a little bit closer with Russia. It's we've seen what can happen, when personal relationships break down between leaders, and particularly when it's Trump. So it wasn't ideal. And just on the point you were making there of everything seemed to be going very well for 24 hours between Thursday and Friday, and then the Oval Office meeting happened. I completely agree. Obviously, that the media completely shifted their focus after that because the Oval Office was far more important. I would say that from his point of view, Starmer and to the same extent, really, Macron achieved the most that they could. I don't think there's a world in which they could have got that security guarantee last week. I think they were, if anything, trying to lay the groundwork. And obviously what happened on Friday, that couldn't have been prevented by either Starmer or Macron.
I think that was...
As much as it was overshadowed, I don't think it sort of undoes what Macron and Starmer achieved.
The groundwork that they laid in a way. Yeah, I think I agree. And I think that's why the turn of events sort of between Thursday and Friday last week was so shocking to so many people. I remember even when we were working on the daily briefing that day, and this was last Friday, and we wrote a story about Zelensky traveling to the White House that day to sign the minerals deal, which was what was expected to happen and what pretty much the entire Western media expected to happen, because there'd been this renewed hope and optimism generated by the successful meetings of Macron and Starmer with Trump that this would happen and it would be a productive meeting, and it didn't turn out that way at all. And there's been various comments and different analyses about how that could have happened. There's been some commentators suggesting that it was an ambush or that it was a setup by Trump and Vance to effectively humiliate Zelensky and just be able to justify whatever decision they made afterwards, i.e. suspending Ukrainian aid to Ukraine by saying, oh, look, this guy disrespected our country, he disrespected XYZ. But I think let's fast forward again to today, Wednesday. And I saw a report this afternoon that again speaks to Starmer's diplomatic power, effectively, which I think we all saw probably for the first time on the international stage last week with Trump, which was that this afternoon, the Telegraph reported that. So to give some context on this, Zelensky has now, as on Tuesday night, Zelensky published a statement on X saying that he basically proposing a partial ceasefire in the sky, the sea, and on energy infrastructure, which is the UK and French and Ukrainian proposal for a truce. And he also, in this statement, used some language that was very flattering or kind of appeasing to Trump. And so Zelensky said in his statement, he talked about President Trump's strong leadership. He said, "We really do value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence." And he said, "Our meeting did not go the way it was supposed to. It is regrettable that it happened this way." And this afternoon, the Telegraph have reported that it was Starmer who successfully persuaded Zelensky to make that statement on X in a phone call on Tuesday night, because in the days prior, so between Friday and Wednesday, shows how quickly the news is moving, various European leaders had been saying to Zelensky behind the scenes, basically, you've got to apologize to Trump. You're not going to get any kind of security guarantee. You're not going to get this minerals deal signed. You're not even going to get let into the White House unless you apologize. You know, regardless of whether or not you feel you were wrong in that situation, you have to appease Trump if you want to get something from him. And apparently it was Starmer who was the one to actually convince Zelensky in the end. So that also speaks again to his persuasive power, I guess.
I think on this as well, just very quickly, I think the last week has been really interesting just to watch from the outside with Starmer, because this is a person, I mean, obviously we've been following domestic UK politics and Starmer's rise to number 10 for a few years now. Obviously, he was leader of the opposition under Boris Johnson, all the successive prime ministers, and he's never been seen really as a particularly strong figure. He's been seen as someone who's very much benefited from the Conservative downfall domestically, not someone who's really paved his own way to number 10, someone who's very much benefited from the downfall of the sort of previous incumbent government. And we've not really seen him operate on the international stage at all. Since he became, obviously before he became prime minister, and really since he became prime minister, we've seen him have some meetings, but he's not really led anything on the international stage. So it's been really interesting in the last week to see him take such a prominent role on the world stage and lead these discussions really for finding a peace in Ukraine. And I think it really contrasts with his domestic standing. You know, domestically, he's still seen by many as someone who hasn't really got a plan for the country, who's, raising taxes unfairly. There's a list of things that people have grievances for. His poll ratings have slumped significantly. Reform UK has overtaken him in certain polls. So it's been really interesting to see almost a complete reversal on the international stage. Domestically, he's someone who is still really weak, and internationally, he's being really strong. I'm trying to think of a previous prime minister to compare him to here. Sometimes it does happen that you have a bit of a juxtaposition between how they're seen on the international stage and domestically, but that last week was the first time we really saw that, and it'll be interesting in the next few weeks to see whether he can maintain that power on the international stage. I can think of an
example in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
Boris Johnson was someone who was incredibly popular domestically.
Yeah, great example.
But came across as a fool and a clown on the global stage.
And just to add to that as well, when he was ousted as prime minister, people in Ukraine were interviewed and were perplexed as to how can you topple Johnson. He was the person who sort of led the Western response to the original invasion of Ukraine, led the West to provide Ukraine support, was seen as, by many in Ukraine as sort of a heroic figure. And for him to be sort of toppled by his own party, they were a little bit confused by that. So yeah, perfect example in the opposite direction. But yeah, as I say, it'll be really interesting to see whether he can maintain that power on the international stage in the next few weeks. And, with his statements about his plan for peace in Ukraine, it looks like he's very much planning to maintain that sort of power.
Yeah, let's move on to that. Yeah. Starmer's peace plan for Ukraine, because we haven't talked much about that, and that's obviously where the news is moving now. So moving on from the kind of meetings of last week, the UK, French, Ukrainian proposal for a peace plan is this one that Zelensky mentioned in his post on X last night. So to reiterate, it's a ceasefire, it's a truce in the sky, in the sea, and on energy infrastructure. And this was initially floated actually by Macron and by French officials to the media outside of an agreed proposal with other European leaders. And the first kind of comments on that in the media were, oh, this is a classic Macron. He's gone off and said something off the cuff, just thrown this idea out there. But it looks now like actually the UK and Ukraine have kind of agreed that this is the proposal that they want to take forward and to propose to the US as well. Of course, it's impossible to say whether the US will agree to it.
Yeah.
Especially given that Russia has already made clear its stance on no European troops being involved in protecting a future ceasefire, which would have to happen, and which Starmer has said has to happen in order for there to be a lasting peace. It also clashes now with the new US position, which is pretty much that of the Kremlin.
Yeah.
But we will see how this develops over the coming days. One thing to say, though, on this is Zelensky said, and this was part of the reason that he had such a clash, such a bust up with Trump last week, was that Zelensky was trying to make the point with Trump in the interview that Russia is unequivocally the aggressor in this situation. Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine's sovereign territory in February 2022. And last month, the US voted with Russia, with North Korea, to oppose a UN resolution naming Russia as the aggressor on the third anniversary of the war. Zelensky was trying to make this point to Trump that you can't trust Putin. You can't trust that Russia is going to abide by any ceasefire plan. And Trump just didn't want to hear it because Putin is clearly a pal of his now. And this goes back again to in 2014 to 15, after Russia's backing of Russian separatists in the eastern Donbass region, which fell to Russia in 2014. There was a ceasefire known as the Minsk Agreement, which was also brokered by the UK and France. And
with no peacekeeping force.
Yeah, with no peacekeeping force, and it was repeatedly breached by Russia. So in Zelensky's head, we can't agree to a ceasefire without European or NATO boots on the ground because Russia will breach it.
And from the UK and France's perspective, as much as they're happy, so they've used the phrase coalition of the willing, which are countries that would voluntarily back the UK and France. Obviously, even that language is trying to pressure the US into agreeing. It's sort of equivocal to the Iraq and Afghanistan war when other Western countries came to the US's aid following 9/11. So that even the language there is trying to sort of pressure the US. But they've been very clear that even so, the UK and France are the only two countries that have so far committed to putting boots in the ground. Other countries they're hoping will join them. But even if that was to happen, the issue is that the force wouldn't be large enough to fight Russia were they to attack the peacekeeping force. So Starmer and Macron are effectively saying, look, we need the US as a guarantor that if we are attacked, that they will then step in. And that's where they haven't been able to get Trump yet. This is what we were discussing earlier.
I read a statistic today that by the BBC defense editor, Frank Gardner. Sorry if I've got his title wrong. But Frank Gardner, I think, quoted Zelensky saying that there would need to be 600,000 troops stationed along the current ceasefire lines to police it. And without the US, there's even 600,000, Frank Gardner was saying, is a wildly optimistically low number. But even looking at that number without the US, European armies would really struggle to field that number of peacekeeping troops. So we'll see once this plan gets presented to Trump, what he says and what happens in the coming weeks. But we can't quite understate how urgent this issue is for Europe and for Ukraine at the moment. And we'll have to see what comes of that in the coming days.
Yeah.
So with that, moving on to the second part of our podcast episode today, which is our cabinet review, where we discuss one of Starmer's cabinet ministers each episode and what they're up to.
And we're yet again this week, we're breaking the format slightly because they're no longer a cabinet minister.
They are not. This week, we are discussing Anneliese Dodds, who was, until last Friday, Starmer's Minister of State for Development and also for Women and Equalities. And this is because last Friday, Anneliese Dodds resigned from her position. And this was because of the UK government's announcement that it will be funding an increase of defence spending from 2.3% of GDP to 2.5% of GDP by 2027, largely through significant cuts to the international aid budget. And Anneliese Dodds, I think very respectfully and graciously, held off on making public her resignation or sending her resignation letter to Starmer until he'd returned from the White House with Donald Trump, because she knew that that was an important diplomatic event for the UK and for Europe, and she didn't want to overshadow that by quitting. But on Friday last week, she sent this letter to Starmer, and her argument was that this massive cut in overseas aid will result in food and healthcare being removed from desperate people, that it's being portrayed in the media as the UK following in Trump's footsteps, given the US has paused all foreign aid through, and Dodge, led by Elon Musk, is trying to shutter the entire foreign aid agency, and that it will also lead to a UK pullout from African, Caribbean and Balkan nations, while Russia is increasing its international presence. And finally, which is perhaps the most interesting point here, is that she said in her letter, "I expected we would collectively discuss our approach to fiscal rules and to taxation." And in that, she's implying that there could have been a broader conversation within the cabinet about how to fund this increase in defense spending. But instead, it sounds like Starmer and Rachel Reeves have, or possibly with other cabinet ministers, have made this decision to take it from the aid budget without kind of a broader conversation. And it's important to note, I think, that this issue is a cross-party issue. There's MPs from all parts of the political spectrum who've spoken out against the government taking its funding its defense spending through the aid budget, because there's this idea that there are 3 Ds to foreign policy: diplomacy, defense, and development. And if that's how you think about it, Starmer is fulfilling 2 of those 3 at the moment, right? He's fulfilling diplomacy and he's fulfilling defense. But by cutting development, in the long term, that will result in more displaced people from countries that are suffering from war or famine. It will also result in more migration, therefore, away from those countries, potentially ending up on Europe and the UK's shores. And these are problems that are going to come back to bite the UK effectively in the long term.
Yeah, I think it's a very valid point. So just firstly, on the actual resignation itself, I think it was the right thing to do to wait until Starmer came back. I think that is just in the national interest to not disrupt what was going on between Starmer and Trump on Thursday. So I think it was the right move to hold off, and I think that she deserves a lot of respect.
She really does.
I think that was a really good move. In terms of exactly how it's funded, as you say, I think there's a lot of questions probably within the Labour Party, and particularly on the left of the Labour Party, about this decision. Obviously, you can see why defence spending needs to be increased. I think there's a legitimate argument for that. I think there'll be a lot of people that will be in support of that decision. I don't think there'll be that many people that are opposed to that. I think exactly how you fund it, that is a very open question. And as you say, taking it from the international development aid, that's I think you can see why people are frustrated about that. It's as a proportion of income, it's not a huge amount already, and there were other ways to fund this. And it seems yet again that the government have tied their own hands on tax and spend in the run-up to the election last year, to the point that there were just not that many options available to them. But again, it's worth reiterating, they've tied their own hands. Nobody else is made these promises. They made the promises. They made the promises not to increase certain taxes. They made the promises not to take on certain levels of borrowing. They tied their own hands on this.
You could also argue, as I think Anneliese Dodds was, they're also the ones who can untie their own hands.
Well, yeah, that's the point I'm trying to make.
The image doesn't quite work.
Yeah.
But, and this is
they
what
have
she's
no one else
suggesting.
to blame for this. If their argument is, well, we promised not to increase X, Y, and Z, even if you accept that as an argument, and a lot of people won't, and rightly so, I think that's there's no need to, the situation has changed significantly. I think a lot of people will accept that argument, but just to be clear, they were the ones that tied that. Nobody else did. They didn't need to commit to these things, and yet they did, and that's how they found themselves in this situation. The point that I'm making is I'm very sympathetic to arguments that they could have funded this elsewhere. I think this is an issue that, as you say, there's a lot of purposes to international aid and development, and I think although you won't see that in the short term, the issues will crop up in the long term as a direct result of decreasing this spending.
I do have a question for you on this, which ties in nicely with the final part of our podcast. But how much do you think this decision to fund the increase in defence spending from a cut to international aid, as opposed to, for example, raising domestic taxes, national insurance, VAT, or corporation tax, how much do you think focusing on that, thinking about the cuts to foreign aid, is one of these two things, either an attempt to appease Trump in the US and follow in the footsteps of Doge, suspending all foreign aid and trying to shut down US aid, the agency, or an attempt to kind of win back reform voters who are concerned with the UK, throwing billions of pounds at helping foreign countries that have got nothing to do with us?
Well, to be quite honest, I think it's because he thinks it will assuage quite a lot of different groups. I think the Conservatives have been on board with this decision. Kemi Badenoch hasn't really criticised it. Reform as well, as you rightly point out. Trump in the US, the right-wing media in the UK. I think all of these groups, when you're looking for something to take funding from, in order to fund defense spending, again, I'm saying this simply as a strategic point, not as a moral point. I don't think I'm not making any moral aspersions on whether I think it's right for him to do this, but if we're looking for motivation as to why you're taking up the aid budget, you're assuaging all of those groups. Also, and this is at a time when there is a lot of sort of bipartisan support for Starmer's actions on the international stage. So, if he were to take this from elsewhere, you would upset one of those groups, which would then sort of undo this sort of bipartisan nature of his actions on the international stage. And I think, again, I'm casting no moral judgment on this. I'm simply saying that in taking it from foreign aid, it's meant that the Conservatives hasn't criticised him. It's meant Reform haven't criticised him. It's meant the right-wing media haven't criticised him. It's meant that Trump haven't criticised him. I think there's a lot of different people that none of those will come out and ardently sort of go, it's not right that you're taking it from foreign aid. The people that it upsets are those on the left in his own party. But we've seen this from Starmer since he became leader. He's really not that concerned about people on the left in the Labour Party. It's in a lot of ways he's reduced their influence in the party. He's, in the run up to the election, there was a lot of, deselecting their candidates. There isn't that much of a presence, a unified presence on the backbenches that could present a threat to Starmer. That's the group that it will upset. And that's a group that Starmer's sort of deliberately weakened and is now really not that threatened by.
All right. And now that brings us on nicely to our final part of the podcast, which is where we discuss another story in UK politics. And this week, we are talking about the Trump-Farage relationship and whether Trump is hurting Farage.
Yeah, so this is a video where we're actually, I don't know whether it will have released by the time this podcast comes out. I think it will have. But essentially, it was an interesting article that was written by Luke Trial, who is one of the key pollsters at More in Common. He was writing for the FT when he wrote this. And I think it's a really interesting argument, and he's got quite a lot of data to back it up. And essentially, his main premise for this argument is that Farage has aligned himself quite closely with Trump. So far, that's not caused him too many problems. However, the events of the last couple of weeks are really starting to cause Farage problems because of his close alignment to Trump. The two sort of policy areas that he cites for this are, one is climate change and the fact that Farage has been sort of climate skeptic for a little while. And although that hasn't, that might not have lost him voters in the last few years, that coupled with the second policy area, which is Trump's close relationship with sort of Putin, or Trump's sort of more alignment with Putin and skepticism of Zelensky, Farage is also aligning himself with Trump on that. And if Farage keeps doing this, then he's going to alienate himself from UK voters, because on both of those things, voters across the political spectrum, voters across age groups and their voting intention are generally supportive of climate policies and more sort of investment in net zero technology, and they're supportive of Ukraine and Zelensky and very critical of Putin. So Farage hasn't really been hurt that much so far, but particularly on the climate side of things. But he's starting to hurt on the on the international element of this. And a really good sort of statistic just to back all of this up is that at the 2024 general election, More in Common asked people, in your view, which of the following, if any, is the main reasons not to vote for Reform UK? And they can select up to 3. Now, the option that most people selected, so this was 34%, is that some candidates and party members are racist. That was the big reason that they weren't voting Reform. Since then, we've seen a 9-point increase in Farage's support for Trump. And that is now the biggest reason that people cite for not supporting Reform UK.
Which is quite interesting, because Trump hasn't necessarily, he's not shamed the UK as a country in the same way that he has attacked the EU, for example, which he criticised for falsely being established to, quote, screw the US.
Yeah.
He's not said anything like that towards the UK. In fact, he's been overly, he's really flattered the UK. When Starmer went to meet him, Trump was saying that your country was beautiful. He loves the royal family. He's excited to come for his 2 state visits. Why do you think that relationship, what is it about that relationship that's hurting Farage?
I don't think it's so much, I think partly it's the relationship, but I think it's just partly that he's aligned. It's the relationship is that he's trying to be supportive of Trump, including on policy area. So it's not so much that Trump is sort of, whether he's criticising or not criticising the UK, it's that Trump supports policies that the UK public doesn't. And Farage is, in trying to maintain a relationship with Trump, espousing the same sort of opinions on those policy areas. And again, those policy areas being climate and support or, lack of support for Ukraine. Another good sort of metric that he found is that, like, public perceptions of Nigel Farage, and again, this is of all Britain, so this isn't Reform voters. There's a lot of people agreed with the phrase that Farage is either in the pocket of Donald Trump or Britain's Donald Trump. So there's a lot of people do think that he's quite closely aligned or is quite similar to Donald Trump, and Trump just has opinions that the British public don't agree with. And in the last week, as I say, after all we've discussed so far on this podcast about the way that Trump has treated Zelensky, etc., it's just not a thing that people in the UK support. The UK, and again, it's difficult to tell whether it's because parties have had a unified approach and it's been a bipartisan issue for support for Ukraine, or parties have, and therefore public opinion is also very much with Ukraine, or public opinion is very much with Ukraine and therefore there's bipartisan support. It's hard to know which way around that goes. But either way, across the political spectrum, there is just sort of very little disagreement that we're supportive of Ukraine, we're supportive of Zelensky. And Farage aligning himself with Trump's opinion on this is already, starting to hurt him, and will probably continue to hurt him if he continues with this strategy.
So to ask a clarifying question, what has Farage, said or not said, and other members of Reform about Ukraine specifically since last week? Or is it just that their silence is enough to suggest that they're being too cautious about not saying something that Trump wouldn't like?
So after Friday, Farage had sort of blamed Zelensky for what had happened and suggested that he should have worn a suit because Trump's incredibly old-fashioned about dress codes, and that Zelensky had overplayed his hand, and it was very unwise for him to tell the US what would happen if they didn't support Ukraine. So he'd sort of defaulted to his position of support Trump, support what he does. So there are things that he's sort of gone out and said. And also, if you just look back over the last few years, whenever Trump comes out and says something, generally a bit provocative, Farage will just take that role of going on the British airwaves and defending whatever that is. And sometimes it does make him look a bit ridiculous. But again, that's his strategy. That gets him in the pocket of Donald Trump.
But what do you think? What is he trying to get out of being close to Donald Trump? Because if it's not working with the British electorate, and if we're even seeing right-wing tabloids, even publications like The Telegraph, which have really quite enjoyed, attacking the current Starmer administration, now giving quite favourable coverage to Starmer and not really saying much about reform at all. What is his game?
I think there's a few different pros to this strategy. I think one of them is just the allure of being in the ear of the president. I think there is something attractive to Farage of that. I don't think it does help him electorally, but I think it's a power move, isn't it? It's something that being close to the president, I think he likes that. I think if you are looking at more like tangible benefits for him in the UK, I think there's more money in the US. There's more money in US politics, and getting close to Trump and, winning over Republican donors. We saw a few months ago, before his falling out with Musk, this flirtation of a huge amount of money being sent from the US to reform UK. And although that fell through, although Elon Musk fell out, if he continues to have a big media presence in the US and Donald Trump keeps supporting him and all this, there's nothing to say that in the next few months or years, some other Republican donor, impressed by Farage's conduct and how close he is to Trump, and the way that he supports him both in the UK and the US, doesn't give a huge amount of money to reform. We know what campaign finance laws are like in the UK, and that they're quite ambiguous in certain respects, and that there is a way in which he could probably receive quite a large amount of money from the US. I think that is quite a tangible benefit to this strategy. I think as well, it gets him airtime in the UK. There is the saying of any press is good press. Obviously, there's sort of criticisms of that, and maybe there are limits to that. But he's very much benefited from being a controversial figure in the UK and being asked on breakfast radio and getting all that attention here because he's defending Trump and because he's almost being that UK spokesperson for him in a sense. I think that's almost how he gained notoriety and became a big, it certainly propelled him further being that big figure in the UK. I think that sort of helps him in that regard. I
think what was also surprising, maybe after the Trump Starmer meeting we saw last week, was how in my mind, that I was surprised because it seemed like Starmer has kind of filled the role that we thought Farage filled before in being Trump's best buddy in the UK. It's now Starmer.
You realize,
and that's quite interesting to me because they couldn't really be more different, Starmer and Farage. And also, it's
I think
interesting.
they go about it in a different way.
They do. But it's interesting, I think, that Trump doesn't think about, oh, what's my mate Farage going to think if I'm really good pals with Starmer. He doesn't think about what Musk has been saying about Starmer when he, is deciding to be close with him. It's really interesting dynamics that we're seeing between the US and UK at the moment in weird directions.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely something to keep an eye on. I think, whether Farage's closeness with Trump will ultimately backfire.
Yeah. Just for the record, I think in the long run it will.
There you go. Prediction from Ben Blissett. In the long run.
And we all know how my predictions go. They're always wrong.
Great. So I think, unless you've got anything else you want to say?
No, I don't want to make any more predictions that'll turn out to be wrong.
No more predictions on this episode.
Yeah.
We'll wrap up today's episode. Hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a really, really busy couple of weeks in UK and global politics more generally.
I think it'll continue to be busy.
And it will continue. So keep your eyes on Starmergeddon. Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast channel. And
yes,
you do it, Ben.
Yeah.
Go on.
And make sure you watch the interview with the Prime Minister on the UK channel, which will be releasing very soon.
With our own Ben Blissett. Our very own.
Yeah.
And with that, goodbye. Have a great weekend. And look forward to TLDR's interview with the UK Prime Minister next week. It's going to be big.
There we go.
Bye.